Hi, my name's Dawn Davies.
My name is Dave Broom.
And we're here today to give you a bit of a sort of walkthrough of the different regions of what we are calling the New World. Now, is that an appropriate title, Dave?
No, I find it a patronising title. I find it an imperialist title. The New World of Whisky, I think, would be okay.
Yes, and I think when we're talking about the New World, it's kind of almost not a catch-all, but I think it's a catch-all for kind of regions that are up and coming, that maybe actually are not all up and coming, because today we'll look at Japan, which has got a long history, but it's kind of those regions that are not in Europe and not in Americas. Is that a fair point?
That's as good a way of getting out of that particular conundrum as I've heard. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm excited about by this category is actually there's so much newness out there right now, and you have been amazing at giving me little snippets of information on who to go and talk to, who to taste. But is there for you kind of a very sort of are there kind of characteristics that you're seeing coming out of certain regions, do you think, or countries?
I think we almost automatically look for that. We want to find this kind of unified style that there's a Japanese style. I think there probably is a Japanese style, but Japan's been making whiskey for 100 years. Is there an Australian style? No, I don't think there is. I don't think there's a Kiwi style, etc., etc. I do think, however, that if you look at that question in a slightly different way, and rather than trying to say, is there a kind of unified flavour, is there a unified mindset? And I think quite definitely there's an Australian mindset of making whiskey and a New Zealand mindset. And that comes down to using resources, it comes down to climate, it comes down to the conditions that they are working within. And that may have an impact on flavour, but I think it's too simplistic to kind of go, it's coming from this country, therefore it's all going to taste roughly the same.
But I guess I think in the countries that are a bit newer, maybe they're less bound by regulation, or they're trying to define themselves still. But yeah, I think you're right. If you look at Australia and if you look at New Zealand, they're using, for example, maybe more wine casks for aging, not finishing, which is very trendy. Don't start me down the rabbit hole. But, that would be an example maybe of where a style will start to emerge because of that. Do you think?
I think undoubtedly. And also the fact is that for a new industry, this is a perfect time to test out what you can make. So what can I do with different smokes? What can I do with different distillation techniques, maturation techniques? This is the right time to be doing the experimentation. So I'm embracing this wild variety that you're beginning to see from all around the world. I think it'd be incredibly boring if people just turned up and went, well, we know how to make whiskey, and essentially we're doing it exactly the same way as it's done in Scotland, and it's all going to taste exactly the same. That's not what it's about. It's about trying to find your own personality as a distiller. And
I think what's quite exciting is, we're now starting to get some of these new distilleries over in Europe for sure, and we'll talk about Thompson's and Starwood to an extent, because Starwood's been here a lot longer, but there's so many brilliant distilleries out there that we're just waiting to discover, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, I always say to people that we are living in a golden age of whiskey production. There have never been so many distilleries making whiskey around the world. Every country where distillation is legal is making whiskey, so the choice is incredible, the knowledge is incredible, the way in which all the distillers are beginning to work together, so there's a technique used in Japan, can I adapt that to work here? So there's this really interesting kind of global network that's beginning to build up. Yes, they have their own individuality, but there's this shared experience and shared knowledge. I think it's a hugely exciting time.
And I think also not even just in whiskey, I think there's shared knowledge across different spirit categories in one, especially where you have big kind of companies that have the ability to make rum in one country, and like whiskey or gin, and I think there seems to be a much more collaborative approach to distillation full stop.
Absolutely.
And what we're learning,
Absolutely.
which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So I guess we should, Dave, I'm feeling thirsty.
I'm gasping.
So maybe we should dive into sort of one of the first countries we wanted to look at, which was Japan. And you know, I think you quite rightly said, you know, Japan has a very long history of distillation. And actually, though, at the moment is in a bit of sort of moment of change,
yes,
I guess you could say, which is as exciting? Is it
hugely exciting?
Which...
Hugely exciting. For a whole number of reasons. You know, Japan went into, you know, the evolution of the Japanese industry in a nutshell, you know, built on blends, really right up until the end of the last century, when single malt began to take off. Obviously, there's issues over lack of regulations, which fingers crossed are going to change. But just even when I was 7 years ago, looking at Japanese whiskey, there weren't that many distilleries. It was kind of just the big boys who were there, plus, you know, Chichibu. Essentially, that was it. Now, you know, there's distilleries popping up left, right, and centre, and that is hugely exciting. And they're smaller scale, and they're really kind of testing this idea of what Japanese whiskey is all about. So they're working off an existing template, if you want, and an existing 100 years of experience. But there's a lot of very exciting new distilleries appearing in Japan. But you know, we've got one of the older ones from 1970s.
And this is a proper classic.
No,
I mean, for me, this is, you know, so this is the Hakushu 12. And, you know, this for me is quite quintessentially Japanese. For me, one of the kind of characteristics I tend to get out of Japanese whiskey when they're 100% Japanese is definitely that elegance. I think, you know, no matter what you taste, there's just this vein of real kind of linearity to the whiskies. I don't know, you've tasted 100 times more than me, but...
There's, I think the first time I asked what a Japanese whiskey was to a Japanese distiller, he said they have a transparency to them. And I think they do. You can see right into them. There's a clarity about the aroma. There's a precision about the way that the flavours appear in the palate. There's a delicacy, but an intensity at the same time. And part of that is achieved through a kind of blending mentality to making single malt whiskey. Because Hakushu, you know, is making 6, 8, 10 different styles of whiskey. Every time I go there, I get told there's another style getting made. But, you know, so all stills of different shapes, different sizes, peated, medium peated, unpeated, different fermentation times, different yeast being used. So it's a blending factory. So within this single malt, there are different components, different flavour components. And as you move through the Hakushu range, those components will shift. So it's a blending mentality to single malt. And thinking about the production and the making, the crafting of this particular whiskey, what you're looking at is saying, well, actually, as a whiskey maker, you're going, well, I want this delicacy, but I want a little bit of this coming through and a little bit of depth, I want this, a tiny little thread of smoke, perhaps. It's a very different way of thinking about how to make a single malt whiskey. Rather than kind of only being able to use age and cask, you can actually use different distillates.
So do you think that's what makes Japanese whiskey to an extent unique, is that ability to, as you say, it's the distillate that gives you the blend as opposed to age and...
Yeah, I think so. Certainly from the established distilleries. And it's interesting to see the new distilleries, some of them also taking that approach. And also, you know, spinning back to, you know, we were talking about Japan, but spinning back to Scotland, you've got Ardnamurchan making two styles and blending them together. Razzie making two styles, blending them together.
Well, Loch Lomond has...
Loch Lomond, you know, doing it. So, you know, that kind of Japanese approach is now becoming slightly more common around the world.
And I mean, we look at Japan, and the one thing I think we probably should talk about, and maybe a good comparison is actually looking at something like looking at India, is temperature and how much that affects different parts of the world. And again, when we look at the Thompsons and the Starwood, we'll see it very starkly. But you know, if we look at sort of Japan and that climate, you know, how important is that in the maturation?
Hugely, and it's interesting because if you go to Japan and you speak to Japanese people, they all say, well, we are a small country. And then you go, well, you might be a small country, but you're not actually, you're actually a very long country. But you're dwarfed by the fact you've got Russia, you've got an entire continent sitting opposite you. But in terms of temperature, you'd be going from the far south of Kyushu, or even Okinawa, where some whiskey is getting matured now, which is tropical, subtropical climate, all the way up to Hokkaido, which is freezing cold. You've got different altitudes as well. Hakushu is a very high distillery. So Hakushu, maturation-wise, is actually quite a cool climate. Yamazaki is very different again. So a much wider range of climates in Japan than there is, say, in Scotland. Different levels of humidity, etc. And that is a fundamental element within the way in which Japanese whiskies mature.
And if we say, look, because in this pack we're also looking at India, if we brought India into this now, what do you think is some of the things you're seeing from Indian whiskey, for example?
Well, seeing much more of that extraction, so maturation, a whiskey will be hitting its period of maturity quicker. In a hotter climate, the whiskey and the wood are interacting with each other in a much more rapid fashion, like you do for tropical aging for rum, for example. So you're seeing slightly bolder flavours, perhaps more cask forward, so that's kind of got to be controlled, but they're just kind of bigger and broader and more powerful. And from a distiller's point of view, if you're going to be having this kind of big wood impact, there's kind of two ways you can go around it. One is by beefing up your distillate so the distillate can cope with more wood, or using some refill casks as well. So, achieving that balance is done in a very different way in a hot climate than in a cooler climate, actually.
And I'll never forget when I went to Taiwan and we went to Kavalan and literally got into that cellar and I was just sweating, and they were like, that's the ground floor, it gets hotter on the 8th. And I was like, oh my goodness. And, you can see how that was
you
massive.
Can watch it evaporate.
It's like 13% in Kavalan, I think, So, that really rapid extraction. So for me, like one of the hallmarks of whiskies from Kavalan, and in fact, to an extent, a bit of Taiwan, actually not even just whiskey, but rum, is that really big concentration. It's almost like India, it goes sort of Japan, very just sort of gentle, beautiful. India, you're getting a little bit more weight, and then Taiwan's like, hello, my friend.
Slap you in the face. Yeah, but because there's these three elements here that you get in maturation. You've got the subtractive element where the cask and evaporations take away aggressive elements from the new make. You've got the additive component, which is bringing the flavours from the wood into the spirit. And then the most important one is that interactive element, which is when all the flavours from the wood and the flavours from the spirit work together with air. And when you speed up that process, getting that interactive element is actually more difficult because that really kind of only comes with time. So being able to try and control that and understand that is, I would say, the biggest challenge for a whiskey maker in a hot climate.
And actually that maybe is a good time to kind of bring in the next two. So seamless transition.
This is delicious, by the way.
This is absolutely fantastic.
It smells of the woods in which it was made, all green and fresh.
But it's also quite juicy. It's got this really lovely kind of, as you say, grassy tones. There's just a lick of something so slightly smoky on there. It's just kind of...
And acidity.
Umami.
Yeah, there's umami, but there's also acidity.
Yeah.
It's something that Japanese whiskey makers always talk about, which is they want that acidity, that brightness in the back of the palate. And it's something you don't hear a Scottish distiller talk about.
No, and you know, I talk a lot about sort of mouthfeel and texture and acid and tannin because of wine, like for me it's kind of a natural thing to look at, and it is quite interesting, like I always say, your acid test is if you taste something and then you swallow, and then you open your mouth, and if you dribble on the floor, that's got good acidity. That's my top tip as a master of wine, Dawn Davies.
Watch out for that as we move through our tasting.
Dave's going to try. So I think, one of the things you just put up on, let's look at the Thompsons next.
Let's look at Thompson. Yeah.
Which one's Thompsons? You just said actually in warmer climates, and this is probably more relevant to Australia, but I think it's probably good to touch on, is that, it's not rapid aging as such, but there's, as you say, much more kind of interaction of the wood notes. So it does make it a quicker process to just grab as much from that oak and that wood and that oxygen as possible. So, we know in Europe and in Scotland that, because we are no longer part of Europe, so note that I remembered to call Scotland separately to Europe. So proud of myself. I haven't talked about Ireland yet. But, we kind of very much have to have, it's 3 years before it can even be called a whiskey. Now, you go to Australia, it's 2 years. do you think that actually where the whiskey comes from should maybe the laws should reflect that aging process, that, for want of a better word, terroir, because I love that word.
You do
sense
love that
of
word.
place.
That sense of place.
I'm going to advertise Dave Broom's new book coming out, Sense of Place, end of September. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
2022, just in case you're watching this in the future. So anyway, back to the question.
Which was? Oh yeah. Should regulations change? No, I don't think so. I think there's this kind of trend. Maybe it's because I'm old and grumpy about these things, but whiskey is a long-term business. So even in a rapid maturing climate, it's still a long-term business. You still need time to get to that level of balance and complexity, which is what you want in a whiskey, what you want in a rum or a wine or whatever. Balance, complexity, character. The three fundamental parts. And I think if you just scrapped any age requirements, you would get an awful lot of immature or over-aggressive whiskey. Pushing it in tiny barrels, which I think has been an issue with Australian whiskey in particular. So no, I'm quite happy. 3 years works. But by chance, to be honest, it wasn't brought in for quality reasons after the First World War. But by chance, 3 years is kind of right for Scotch. It might be 2 years, so you might begin to hit the start of that maturation curve in a warmer climate. But I don't think that the law should necessarily change to suit that.
And I guess also, we talk a lot about oak interaction, but that oxygen interaction and that time, you said it very well, like when we were talking earlier about sort of a product we were tasting, you've got to have time for that whiskey to permeate into that sort of that wood and not just hit that kind of outer level. And that oxygen interaction is just going to oxidize the alcohols, which is going to give you more complexity. And, there's so much more than just it's sitting in a barrel. And it's taking
oxidation is hugely important. I get really quite, as you can tell, quite
emotional.
Quite emotional, quite excited about this. It's one area, everybody talks about casks and you forget about the air. But the oxidation of flavours are really, really important, and that only comes with time.
And I actually just sticking my nose in that. That's just such a beautiful whiskey. So this is Thompson's, and I'm going to give Dave Broom 100% for putting me on to these guys, because they're a small distillery.
Small.
It's husband and wife team, and Matt is, just doing some incredible stuff distillation wise, and that we launched a wine cask, finished with them a Pinot Noir cask, aged. 2 years ago, and it was absolutely stunning. But this is their Manuka Smoke, and Dave and I, when we were chatting about kind of what we were going to talk about on this tasting, is that actually we thought we didn't want to talk so much about the whiskies themselves, but maybe what kind of those whiskies spurred in our thoughts and our processes, and something we were talking very much about. And sustainability is a huge topic right now. Is local. Yeah,
absolutely. And Matt. So this is from New Zealand, and I think that. Again, it's that geography thing, and Kiwis really hate this idea that they are just some island just off the coast of Australia, and they're not. It's quite a long way. As you find out when you're flying there. God, we're not there yet, but thank God when you arrive, it's amazing. But there is this assumption it's the same as Australia, and the whiskies are going to be the same as Australia, and they're not, because the climate is different. The climate, especially. It's cooler. It's the further south you go, and the most southerly distilleries in the world are in New Zealand.
And wineries.
It's going to get a lot cooler. And also, for me, the Kiwi whiskies have got a lightness and a sweetness and an elegance to them. I'm not saying Australian whiskies aren't elegant, but Australian whiskies tend to just be that little bit more forward. And the New Zealand whiskies just tend to be that little bit more restrained.
I almost likened. I remember when I first tried these ones, especially. I was like, "There's something that reminds me of Japan here." That there's a coolness to the whiskies, and I think definitely when you taste this one, there's definitely that elegance. There's that lovely purity. It's again that very linear style, which I think for me is something that I, as I mentioned before, is something I associate with Japan, but. Then there's just a little bit more richness and a little bit more body, and And this one, I just think I could drink this all day, frankly.
It does a lovely feel to it, and kind of going back to that point, which I completely ignored. The resources, New Zealand is a long way from anywhere. So if you're making whiskey there, are you really going to start importing your barley from Scotland or even from Australia? You're going to want to be looking to local resources. Is there peat? Well, there is peat there, but are you wanting to really dig up carbon sinks? Manuka Smoke is quite interesting. So it's using a local smoke, which is used for food. So a lot of distillers kind of taking cues from food culture. And it's just adding this other little layer, which is unique to that particular country. And here we have that signature beginning to develop, that style beginning to develop.
And these guys used a lot of Pinot Noir casks. As we know, New Zealand is very famous for its Pinot Noir. And when I look at cask finishing, Dave and I have had this conversation probably about 100 times, it's the quality of the wood and it's the quality of what's gone in that wood. And, these guys are sourcing from some very good producers in New Zealand, so that they have all those touch points, they're not relying on a broker that's buying barrels from God knows who, they really have all the steps of the process is very controlled. And I always say it with wine, you can't make good wine from bad grapes. Well, the same is true from bad barley or bad casks, especially, and that control in a smaller country with a smaller sort of distribution network has to be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. But there's a beautiful succulence in the middle of the palate. The smoke's very subtle. Matt's just making phenomenal whiskies. And I'm so excited by the quality coming out of New Zealand. All the distilleries in New Zealand. Keep an eye out for them, guys. They are coming over here. Seek them out because
coming to a Whisky Exchange near
and they're
you.
young. This is new.
I think this is 4 years if I remember rightly. And the climate is there. So the climate actually would encourage slightly longer maturation. So the way that these are going to evolve over a decade or so, it's going to be amazing. Yeah. And we have seen some very old whiskies coming out of Australia. The New Zealand Whisky Company, Australia out of New Zealand, has evidence. I mean, we've got online a 17-year-old at the moment. We used to have, I think it was a 23, 24. There's evidence that there is an aging ability in these countries, and I think that's what's super exciting. Yeah. So let's move on to Australia and to Starwood, which actually for me was it was probably Hellier's Road and Starwood and Overeem were probably the first 3 Australian whiskies I ever tried. Sure. And one of the things we talked about earlier was that actually price point in Australia is quite challenging for bringing over to Europe because a lot of the whiskies are a little expensive. But actually Starwood did a really great job of launching a whiskey at a really affordable price and just super drinkable, super mixable actually as well.
Yes, and the thing for me about the Australian industry and the way the Australian industry started off or restarted rather, because it does actually have a long heritage of whiskey making, but the new era of Australian whiskies tended to be small distilleries, so small production. They tended to be using exactly the same still shape. They were all kind of putting it into small casks. They needed the cash in, they needed the whiskey out quickly. So you were getting these kind of really fascinating, but again, super extracted kind of whiskies coming out. And one reason for export or the difficulties with export was because production levels were so small, so tiny. And what the Australian industry really needed was scale. Some distilleries to come and go, right, we're going to be making whiskey at a larger, in larger volumes. Starward did it, Archie Rose has done it up in Sydney. Morris, which is a new distillery that just starting up, that's going to be giving scale. And I think that having that breadth of offering from a really small micro distillery right up to something larger like Starwood is really important for the future of an industry. So I'm really excited by it, and I think the quality coming at Starwood is spot on.
And I think we've got to look at Australia the same way as looking at, say, Japan. Yes, we think of it as a hot climate, but there are very cool pockets. Yeah. Like you look at the Mornington, you look at Tasmania. These are cool climate areas. They have those sea breezes. It's chilly. So I think there is potential to do quite a breadth of range of style.
There is. There's some really interesting whiskies coming out of Mornington, actually, which have got this slight salinity to them. Flinders Island, the distillery in Flinders Island, which is, again, it's kind of picking up, it's almost like the Isle of the Isle of Australia, so again, a huge range of different climates, huge range of different possibilities as well, in terms of resources. There's not a lot of water, Australian distillers are incredibly conscious about sustainability, because that is top of their mind, top of any Australian's mind, is, being able to survive in what's a pretty harsh climate. And there's an amazing malting, it's called Voyager malting, so in Riverina, which is best known for, hot, lots of irrigation, lots of wine, massive amount of cereals getting grown. But Voyager are now doing heritage varieties. They're planting different cereals, a beautifully integrated system, doing different smokes. So a lot of the water being used is going back for irrigation, etc. Trying to move to lower inputs and everything. And they have a bar there. So all the breweries. Imagine this in a malting.
Move there.
Imagine this in a malting in the UK. There's a bar where you can have the beer made from their barley, and whiskies made from their barley, and it's this real kind of deep look into sustainability and local and growing local and understanding what's possible. And that could be wood, and it could be whatever, like red gum casks.
And that's the thing. I think it's super interesting, and I know like Archie Rose are playing. We're looking at Archie Rose at the moment, and they're playing around with things. The Gospel guys are playing with rye, and their liquid's going to be insane. Yeah. It already is amazing, but it's just going to get better and better. And we talked earlier about kind of the wine cask element coming out of Australia, and that's hugely important because Australia has a massive wine culture. And it makes sense. And so, these guys at Starward are using a lot of Apera casks. So Apera, for want of a better description, is like a sherry. It's a fortified wine. Of course, it can't be called sherry because not made in Jerez. But, that's, again, they're adapting, they're changing, they're looking at what they have locally again, to produce something that's outstanding. And, I think that's what, for me, is so exciting about what's going on in, for want of a better world, the new world.
And Australia is just it's expanding so fast, and the range of whiskies, coming back to that first point, really, the range of whiskies, the range of styles, so you've got rye coming out, you've got single malts, you've got blends, again, thanks to Starward, you're getting blends, but you've got bourbon styles coming out as well, so there's this huge range of different, there's no single thing that's Australian whiskey. I think it's one of the most exciting areas of whiskey making in the world at the moment. We're not seeing a huge amount of it, damn it, but really, seek them out when you can find them, because there's some amazing stuff coming out of us.
And we've touched on sort of about 6 countries that are quite important in that kind of what's going on in sort of a more sort of volume scale. Is there any other countries that you think, wow, in that kind of area of the world that you're just like, there could be some amazing liquid coming out of here, or there's some people that could be doing some interesting things? Yeah,
there's certainly what has come out of Taiwan, what is now also coming out of Taiwan, I think is really interesting. The rest of India, obviously. Again, long distillation history. Perhaps distillation started in India. There's a theory. We're not going down that particular rabbit hole at the moment. But in terms of single malt, we've barely scratched the surface of it, possibilities there, and I think the rest of Asia as well. There's a huge amount. I'm just about to get some samples from China. So Pernod, their distillery is now up and running and at scale. It's China. It's going to be at scale. But their last count, there was 7 dedicated whiskey distilleries in China. There will be more.
And they've got a huge option with grain and with different sort of types of styles and
and
climates. Humid to cold to hot.
High altitude as well. There's some up in the Tibetan, proposed up in the Tibetan plateau. There's not all manner. Some one outside Beijing, which is pretty harsh climate. Then others right down in the south, where things are pretty hot and steamy. So China, Jesus, everywhere.
And I think that's what's, like, you touched on it when we started, that I remember my whiskey journey started with this gentleman here, actually. And I remember, I think you were probably with Sakina, the first people to introduce me to Indian, Japanese, for sure. Even Scotch. And I look at at the time I was working for Selfridges, and I look at there we had maybe like it was 90% Scotch, I would say, and maybe 5% Irish, and then there was like this 5% of kind of world other, American as well. But now I look at our shop shelves, and we have a store that has a huge, London Bridge. It's got a huge range of world whiskies, and you look at it and you think, and that's just gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is actually a series, so there's 3 other talks in talking about different areas of the world, and we'll touch on. Stay tuned. But again, that's something that's hugely exciting. It's that each area, it's almost like a mushroom that's just kind of exploding at the moment.
Absolutely,
insane.
Absolutely. And but for coming back to the Star Wars, really, which we barely talked about. This will be the most widely available Australian whiskey. So please go and try it. You'll have it in your packs, but speak to people about it. I think the balance on this one is just absolutely spot on. It matures very quickly. It goes up in strength, and it's essentially distilled in a tin shed. So it's very hot inside, and it's matured from there as well. So the strength actually goes up in the cask. But controlling that strength is great. There is wood. There's more weight from the distillate, but it's not wood driven.
And it's got this lovely sort of sweetness. It's sort of like a malty character that I really find so appealing. And for me, it's kind of one of the, even if you were just starting your journey in whiskey, I think Starward's a really nice place to start because it is so approachable. There's so much lovely fruit there that, it's a good kind of dip your toe in the water of understanding what whiskey, or even if you're a hardcore bourbon drinker, to kind of move out to go to some of these distilleries like Starwood is probably not a bad.
There's a kind of spicy honey thing going on. Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah, it's a cracker.
We have loved talking to you today, folks, and catch our next 3 episodes as they come, as and when they appear. They should all be online. But thank you very much for listening, Mr. Broom. A pleasure as always.
Cheers. A treat. Slàinte.